Okay, take it away whenever you are all ready.
Okay, and Ksenia, if you have any POIs, just shout it out, unmute. Okay, if everybody is ready, then begin. Hello, my name is Elizabeth Lee, and I'm the first proposition side speaker for the motion. This House believes that food ethics movement should disavow sustainable consumption marketed by large corporations. I'm going to start up with some definitions, give the burdens of this debate, and then I will bring up 2 points of my own. So for starters, ethics is, we're going to look at this utilitarianism framework. So what is better for the earth, what is better for the environment? Because that is the end goal of any sort of sustainability and food ethics movement. Now, disavow is to publicly denounce, to not stand for, and not associate yourself with the acts of these larger corporations. A larger corporation is the top 100 companies, because that's just a good way to see like what's a large corporation. Now, let's to talk a little bit about the burdens of this debate. Both sides have to try to prove that they fight more for sustainability in the United States, in the world at large, and that is why I'm proud to be a part of the proposition. So let's look at my first point, which is corporations are bad for the environment. I think we all can recognize that large corporations are top contributors towards environmental issues in society today. The top 100 companies are responsible for around over 70% of all global carbon emissions. What does that mean? That means that if we sort of don't denounce the acts of these corporations to essentially profit off of the food ethics and sustainability movement, then what we're pretty much saying that we're okay and we're complacent with corporations doing whatever they want. Let's talk a little bit more about some examples of these top 100 corporations attempting to market sustainable consumption. So a great example of that, in fact, an example given in the motion was Starbucks. Now, Starbucks, for example, has promised, back in 2015, they promised to use only reusable cups. They promised to make an effort to be more environmentally friendly. However, they ended up walking that back a year later when it didn't work out for their corporation, when it wasn't as profitable. Now, why is this relevant? This is relevant because large corporations have, at the end of the day, all they want to do is profit. Their goal is money. We live in a capitalist society. We define success by monetary gain. Many people need to sustain themselves, and because of that, their goal is not to be environmentally friendly. Even if you think that the CEO or some higher up wants to be a more sustainable person, you have to understand that all of these corporations, these large corporations, all of them are indebted to their shareholders, and these shareholders' main goal is to make as much money as possible. Now, what does that mean? At the end of the day, being sustainable is not cheap and is in fact very costly. So that's exactly why Starbucks walked back their attempts to be more sustainable. Because, Judge, you have to recognize that the food ethics movement is anti-corporation. The food ethics movement is against these large corporations because they are the reason why we have these environmental issues. Large corporations are what uphold our capitalist society, and in our capitalist society, what we stress the most is profit, and profit and environmentalism cannot coexist. Now let's get into my second point, which is complacency. And it's the fact that the food ethics movement is a grassroots organization. It's by the people and for the people. It's anti-corporation, as I stressed before, because again, corporations are extremely terrible for the environment, whatsoever. But even if Starbucks was able to become more sustainable, if we turn towards larger corporations and let them co-opt a grassroots movement, then that's extremely detrimental. And let me explain why. Now, I'm sure the opposition, they're going to give some sort of case about how we need to normalize environmentalism in our everyday, and the best way to do that is through large corporations. However, think about it like this, Judge. This movement, grassroots movements are better at mobilizing and fighting for a cause. This is because, one, they are not indebted to things like shareholders and other larger corporations, government issued statements, etc. They're able to fight for a cause without the same backlash that a corporation would receive and is entitled to. Furthermore, having a grassroots organization that's by the people is extremely empowering, Judge, because these movements are people, everyday people, you and me, fighting for a cause and fighting against these larger corporations who uphold this sort of terrible system. So by allowing a corporation to co-opt the food ethics movement, one, we're centering the same corporations in which people are trying to fight. Judge, this is so terrible because it's going to create a net. This isn't going to benefit anyone. In fact, this is derailing the actual movement. So let's look back at our framework of utilitarianism to prove to you, Judge, and that why the proposition has won the debate and why you should already be casting your vote for the proposition. It's the fact that the only way we can make actual change in with the environment is if we fight these corporations that uphold this sort of terrible sustainability that sort of hurt the environment. The only way we can achieve environmental success is if we fight against large corporations. Again, I'll say when the top 100 companies are responsible for over 70% of carbon emissions, right? These corporations, they're terrible for the environment, they hurt the environment, etc. So the only way to take down this environmental harm is to fight corporations. And the only way we can fight corporations is if we do not let them co-opt and profit off of this movement. The only way the food ethics movement can work is if we empower people. And there's nothing less empowering than selling out and letting corporations profit off of pretending like they care about sustainability and then realizing that their only sole purpose and their only motivation is profit. And then we'll have another situation like Starbucks where they walk back any attempts to be sustainable. Thank you, Judge. And in order to protect this extremely important movement and keep it empowering grassroots, I encourage you to vote for the government side.
Thank you to the Prime Minister. Thank you to the government. I will be representing the opposition. Before I begin my time, as I'm setting up my timer, a quick roadmap. I'll be first going over the definitions in the framework, citing a few definitions that my opponent did not mention, then over my case, and finally refuting my opponent's case. 8 minutes, if everybody is ready. I'll begin on my first word. Okay, good afternoon, Judge. My opponent, I thank you everybody for coming to this debate. My name is Ksenia Baatz, I she her pronouns, and I'll be representing the opposition in this motion. So to talk about the frameworks and definitions. Firstly, we agree with the frameworks of utilitarianism. This should be judged as what helps the earth the most, what will create the largest environmental impact, and more importantly, what will allow the final goal of turning these companies of making the earth greener happen. Now, for a few definitions, we agree with the opponent's definitions on disavow, Chipotle denounce, with the large corporations, top 100. We'd also like to specify, since this is a debate about food ethics, we are going to be mainly looking at like the top 100 food companies, though as examples, we do think it's apropos to pull up other companies as well. And finally, for definitions, we would like to define food ethics as a movement towards ethical food consumption, i.e. Ethical farming, sustainability, land consumption, etc. And sustainable consumption marketing is the sustainable production and distribution of food. So now moving on from that, I have 4 contentions here. The first one, it has a few subpoints. It is about the movement itself. This one directly clashes with my opponent's second contention about hurting the grassroots movement. The idea is that the first subpoint is that there will be a loss of followers. The fact is that many of these corporations, such as Starbucks and Chipotle, are integral parts of people's lives. As we've said, the United States, especially which is where we're talking about the subject, is basically controlled by these major corporations. And many people who don't have will basically have these corporations as an integral part of their lives. People made whole aesthetics, whole lifestyles around getting their Starbucks coffee in the morning and their Chipotle for lunch. It's become a lifestyle. Shaming people for buying things from these companies, which is what would basically occur if people if these sustainable movements were to denounce these companies. I'll take your POI once I'm done with my first contention. Would basically mean that these people would be forced to choose between something that's an integral part of their life or a corporation that's actively shaming them for trying to live that format. And plus, these companies are already trying to market to these people's feel-good sensors. They're trying not only are they giving them an appealing product, but now they're also trying to market to their sustainability. The only way a grassroots movement can sustain those people and keep them on their side isn't to shame them for going for these companies. It's to try to encourage these companies to change and to actually proactively change. For a real life example, take Starbucks again. Though Starbucks did originally take back its promise in 2015, in 2018, Starbucks began its campaign to replace all plastic straws and has already introduced different cup designs to replace plastic straw consumption. Another version is in the year 2021, the Starbucks began a pilot program in the area of San Francisco, which recently came up on the news, about reusing cups and creating drop-off and pickup stations where these cups could be sanitized. I'll take one right after I finish this contention. About 30 seconds. So overall, we see that this change can happen. Is it as fast as we want? No. But the most important thing is the only way we can change these companies is having a large group in these sustainable movements. And by pushing these people away, you'd be diminishing the amount of people in these movements, hence giving the companies more power. Yes, POI.
First, are those plastic straws no longer plastic straws, these paper straws being made in large factories which contribute to carbon emissions? Yes or no?
Well, for the papers, thank you for your question. To clarify, Starbucks is currently not trying to not use paper straws either. They're going for sippy cup formats. If you look at their, for example, new designs. And yes, I do understand that, of course, we can't eliminate all plastic straws. There are people with disabilities that certainly need plastic straws, but as an overall goal for people that are able to use them, they are trying to eliminate straw consumption overall. Okay. My second point is the companies themselves. Our end goal is to make these companies sustainable. As my opponent had mentioned, the top 100 companies in the world produce about 70% of all pollutants. America is a capitalist system that heavily relies on lobbying and on these corporations, meaning that any grassroots movement will fail without the actual support or somehow changing these corporations. We can't simply just cut them out. Now, what does this mean? The only reason these companies are interested in sustainability is because people think that they're sustainable, is because of the money they can get from these sustainable campaigns. Take, for example, Ford, which is planning to change all their car production to electric cars by 2035. This is giving them a big publicity boost and help them with their advertising and money. The only way we can help companies to change to more sustainable formats is if we are able to allow them to profit off it. Otherwise, they would literally have no other incentive to do it for so. As my opponent mentioned, companies are not ethical beings. So for the interest of this movement, the only way we could actually make companies change would be to allow them to profit off baby steps and eventually keep on pressuring them to move further and further. And finally, my third contention is the fact that by focusing on these major vendors such as Starbucks and Chipotle, we're missing the real culprits in this whole food ethics game. It is the producers. So I'm sorry, I'm running out of time right now, so I won't be taking any POIs at the moment. Thank you though for your question. As of the current moment, if we're going to focus specifically on food, well, the majority of the unethical practices are led by major corporations that are owned outside the US and don't actually interact directly with the customers. These are the meat production farms such as, for example, Brazil's meat production farm, which is famous for deforesting the Amazon and chopping off millions of acres of wood. By hurting Starbucks and Chipotle and all these food, they can't become sustainable until the producers of the food are sustainable. So as a counter plan, we propose that instead of focusing on these vendors that are giving that and shaming them for their green campaigns, we focus on pressuring the companies that do not, the suppliers that do not directly interact with the people, because one, that wouldn't really shame the people. It wouldn't disincentivize them from interacting with the green movement. And secondly, you would actually provide a realistic path for these companies to continue their mass production while being sustainable and ethical. And one final point is the majority of this impact would be basically on the poor. So I'm going to go into my 30-second grace period. With a 30-second grace period, I have 1 minute left. So the majority of these companies, the reason why they become so popular is because they're so easy to buy. Albeit there's some exceptions, such as, for example, Starbucks notoriously $6 venti latte, but still, these are at a realistic price for most people. And especially with the wealth gap growing in the United States, the only way we can actually change is, as I said before, to have a larger consumer base back at the green movement. And that means making sure it's affordable and it can actually be utilized. So by shaming these companies and to giving up on green movements, you're basically shaming people who have to use these companies, who can only rely on these companies from actually participating in the movement. Take, for example, the fashion industry as a quick example. There are plenty of sustainable clothes brands, but because most people can't access them, their impact isn't actually felt, and we still have mass polluters on the run. And for all these reasons, that is why I am proud to oppose. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for the LLC. And now MGC, whenever you're ready, 8 minutes, 30 seconds, Grace.
Great speech. I will start my time now. Hello, my name is Elizabeth B, and I'm the second proposition side speaker. I'm going to start off my speech by really talking about what this debate comes down to and what this debate is about. Then I'll address the 3 points on the opposition side, and then I'll solidify my team's points. So this sort of debate, the opposition tried to frame this debate as if it was about whether or not people should use and consume foods from corporations, etc. However, that's not what this debate is about. This is about whether the movement as a whole should denounce the attempts of these larger corporations to move towards sustainability. And what does that mean exactly? As she already agreed on our definition, let's go back to what it means to disavow something, to publicly denounce. Right? So this isn't attacking the individual person for shopping at Starbucks. No one's going to judge you for buying your $6 venti latte. What this is instead about is whether or not these companies are sustainable or not, whether or not we should define these movements as an effort to help the environment, or whether the sort of marketing of the sustainable consumption by these larger corporations is actually making change in this earth. Now let's talk a little bit about their counter plan. The opposition brought up this plan where we pressure suppliers, and I like to say that's not mutually exclusive. If anything, the food ethics movement has done a lot when it comes to things like targeting factory farming, etc. Saying that this plan can be accomplished in the proposition world, if anything, it can be accomplished in a better way. And here's why, Judge. These companies are the reason why these factory farms exist. Starbucks buys their milk from these large factory farms that create tons of methane and CO2 consumptions, not to mention the treatment of animals is just absolutely terrible. These companies are the reason why these producers exist. So if anything, their counter plan is the exact reason why you should vote for us on the government side, because they agree that these sort of farms, these sort of producers are terrible. And yet it's just extremely hypocritical of them to say, we're okay with companies who do this. We're okay with not denouncing these sort of companies that call themselves and market themselves as sustainable. Now let's talk a little bit about what it means for a company to market themselves as sustainable. I agree with their definition, making efforts to become more sustainable. But what we need to focus more so on the fact is that these companies are now calling themselves these sustainable companies. They're now marketing themselves as a company that is pro-environment, that's pro-earth. And that is extremely detrimental for the reasons I'll get into later when I go over my team's points. Let's talk about their first point, which is that shaming people. Now, I already talked about how that's not really what this debate is about, but let's say you agree with them that by having this sort of grassroots movement say, corporations aren't sustainable, they aren't good for the earth, that's bad. And I can agree. But here's the thing. This movement has never been about targeting specific people, because I think we can all recognize that it's pretty impossible to not go out and eat from a large corporation, etc. However, it's good to be conscious of how often you do that in the first place. Like, while we generally believe that, and furthermore, I'd like to point out that their side focuses more on the act of the individual because they're not holding corporations accountable. With our side, we're focusing on saying that fighting against larger corporations, and we're focusing on taking down these larger corporations who market themselves as sustainable and yet use factory farms, and they produce a ton of CO2, etc. But if we don't fight these corporations and because of that, the producers of these corporations, then who can we hold accountable for this environmentalism? And the only answer is the people. Because what is the food ethics movement if it doesn't hold corporations accountable? Now let's look a little bit more about their side then. If they choose to not hold corporations accountable, if they choose to not denounce and disavow these larger corporations, what they're doing now is placing the guilt on the individual person, something they pretend like they care about. No offense. The thing is, with they're placing the blame now on the consumers. And here's why. They're saying now that, oh, we can't hold corporations accountable, but you should go shop from these corporations because they're extremely green. You should go buy a Ford car because it has this cool environmental benefits of being electric. Well, now they're putting more emphasis on what the consumer chooses to do. And they're highlighting this consumer and their actions. They're saying, go buy a Ford, instead of actually targeting Ford, the company. And that's extremely dangerous rhetoric. They're essentially shaming people who don't buy from these now sustainable corporations. Now, their second point was more about poor people and how, yes, poor people are reliant on these corporations. But I like to point out that that sort of falls under their first point. We can sort of lump them together. And it's the fact that they themselves are placing more emphasis on the individual, because instead of fighting for the dismantlement of these larger corporations, they're instead saying you should buy from these larger corporations because they are sustainable. They're putting more emphasis on what you consume instead of the actual corporation. And I say this simply because their plan is not exclusive. If anything, it falls under this sort of either or fallacy. We can have both in this sort of world. Now, let's talk a little bit more about my team's points. So why we've been emphasizing why these corporations are bad. And I think Ksenia herself can agree that she said it to herself, these corporations are terrible. Their main goal is to make money. If anything, they're using these movements to profit. But why is that so bad? Why do we need to make this movement stay more pure when it comes to dealing with corporations? Like I said, grassroots movements are empowering because they don't involve shareholders. Because when we anchor this if we anchor this movement in corporations, if we let corporations take the wheel with this sort of movement, nothing can be accomplished. Because sure, she brought up the example of getting rid of these little plastic straws, and that's great and everything, but what happens when we ask Starbucks to stop using factory farms? What happens when their little publicity stunt isn't enough? Because Ksenia brought up this idea that companies profit off of environmental activism, profit off of the food ethics movement, but what happens when that stops? Because the truth is that even if these corporations in the short term are able to seem more sustainable, what happens when they're asked to get rid of their factory farms, which are the reason why they're able to make their food so cheap? What happens when you ask them about their large amount of CO2 emissions, about their huge factories, etc.? I already stressed this before, but I have to say this again. These corporations are indebted to their shareholders who want to make money, and as much money as possible. And now let's talk a bit about what a grassroots organization is able to do. Grassroots organizations, like she herself brought up lobbying, grassroots organizations are the reasons why we have more regulation on factory farms. Starbucks does not want you to get rid of factory farms. McDonald's does not want you to get rid of factory farms. You know who accomplished that? Grassroots organizations, because they are not indebted to anyone, able to lobby against sort of these large environmental issues. Ksenia hasn't been able to give an example of a corporation doing much good. And when it comes to like food, except for the fact that Starbucks now doesn't use plastic straws. And if anything, that's just honestly very sad. So thank you, Judge, and thus we affirm.
Okay, thank you for the Member of Government Constructive and MOC 8 minutes 30 whenever you're ready.
Yes, of course. I understand I have 2 speeches here. So I will be taking I will pause my time between the 2 speeches just to, if that's okay with all the judges and my opponent and Elizabeth. So a quick roadmap before I begin. I'll be going down my opponent's refutations, then discussing their case. I will begin discussing my case as well, which I will finish discussing in my second opposition speech, and finish off with some impact calculus in my second opposition speech already. Okay, beginning with the 8 minutes. First, I will go over their case, then my case. Firstly, thank you to the leader of government and the prime minister for their speech. I will be going over now. I will now be going over their case and following with the critiques on my case as well. So firstly, their case has one singular fallacy. They claim the fact that they emphasize the fact that corporations are so powerful in capitalism, and that's why they're so bad. But at the same time, we must realize that these corporations operate in a capitalist system, i.e., we can't really say to them, you need to do what won't make you money. We both agree on that. So the only way for them to actually be sustainable is to make sustainable profitable for them, i.e., to make the shareholders want them to be sustainable. And the way to do that is to allow them to profit off it. Now, from this that's what really falls her first contention, which basically discusses the idea that corporations are bad for their environment and they like to greenwash and profit off these things. That is true. But the only way we can make them good for the environment, because we can't just simply abolish corporations, that's not realistic in a capitalist society. The only way we can actually make corporations sustainable is to make
Why?
I'll just finish critiquing your first point and then I will take your POI. Is to make sustainability actually economically profitable. That will actually encourage shareholders to take over. I gave a concrete example of this, for example, in the automotive industry with Ford. Is it really profitable for Ford to, if there was no hype around it, to switch from diesel and gas to electric car production fully by 2035? No, they have to replace all their factory parts. They have to change all these, they have to find new skilled workers. It's a large monetary effort, but they know that the publicity and the sustainable movement, because sustainable movements are eager for companies to do these movements, instead of shaming these companies for attempting to do only face value movements, Ford would have not gone through with this major step. And since then, other companies have followed. That is the power of putting the money where things are worth. Although grassroots organizations are in thought good, but they're not actually successful in a capitalist society. And right now, as we see, the climate crisis, the animal crises, all these crises are imminent. We do not have time to restructure the whole system to be based off grassroots organizations. We must change the current system to be functioning in a sustainable way, then deal with the repercussions and the downfalls of our current capitalist system. POI, please.
Isn't holding corporations accountable by denouncing them and their bad attempts at sustainability? Isn't that what's going to push corporations to be more environmental?
No, and here's the reason why. This section harkens back to my first contention. The fact is that these corporations are so massive and so many people rely on these corporations that when a person would be forced to choose between the corporation and a grassroots movement, which is now actively shaming them for purchasing a corporation. And the reason it's shaming them, just to go on a quick explanation, is that these movements are mainly social. Please let me finish answering your first POI. These movements are mainly social, along with monetary. So if an environmental movement is going to socially denounce what a corporation is doing, they're basically blacklisting this corporation, and in turn, they will unless this environmental movement is truly intersectional, which is very difficult and not always possible, they will this basically means that it equates people participating with this corporation with participating in negative consumption. And we have seen toxic environmentalism that is exclusionary arise from this kind of mentality. So your original POI is the fact that if people were forced to choose between this corporation and just their daily lives, they wouldn't be able to, because this corporation has already integrated itself so much into their daily lives. They can't really choose to give all the necessary norms to, instead of, for example, if a person said you can't buy Ford because they're still unenvironmental. Well, what if a person can't afford a Tesla? They'd still be left with the least ethical result. You have to actually make and sustainability profitable. Okay, I already began touching on the second contention that basically discusses grassroots. My main response is the fact that grassroots in idea are a perfect way to mobilize people. But the only way for them to be successful is to keep a large group mobilized with them. And by pitting them against organizations, firstly, when they're not denouncing this organization, doesn't mean that they're becoming part of the organization, doesn't mean that they're being co-opted by shareholders. That's not what our side is proposing. It's simply proposing that they do not pit themselves against these major organizations, which we know in the current capitalist system have the upper hand. They have the lobbying power. They have the power to control people's lives, because that will actually hurt them in turn. I want to respond to a few of the refutations. They say that this debate is not going to actually won't actually shame the consumer if we are to shame the companies. But as I already said, the environmental movement is as much social as it is personal, is as much social as it is economic. For example, that's why you've seen this rise of people basically feeling bad whenever they go to Zara or these fashion companies, because they know even if that may be the only place where they can shop ethically, they will personally feel bad. And this is exclusionary, as I've discussed in my second contention, which I already mentioned has a slew of negative downsides, not only being exclusionary towards people of lower socioeconomic status, but also hurting the grassroots organizations and making them more elitist. Because if you're going to make grassroots organizations less accessible to people who rely on these companies, then you're basically putting them in a different version of shareholders. You're putting them into the group of wealthy and elites. Basically, though they may not be a company, you're basically making them being controlled by the rich and the few. Something that will actually corrupt grassroots organization more, turning my opponent's second contention. Following, they discuss the fact that if we don't hold corporations accountable, I'd like to bring my opponent back to the definition of corporations they gave. The definition of corporations that we are currently focusing on are the ones that directly interact with the consumer, i.e. Starbucks, Chipotle, McDonald's, all these companies that are directly interacting with the consumer can influence. The corporations my opponent has not included are the producers. And even though my opponent claims that these corporations are sustaining the producers, the fact is that if these producers never existed in the first place, nor would these corporations, you need these producers to function to be able to maintain these kinds of prices. And since we already have ruled out the possibility of completely abolishing these major corporations that interact with the customer, it has become clear that what we need to do now is to make sure that these corporations can function sustainably, bringing me back to my whole point about how you actually have to make sustainability profitable for it to work in a capitalist system. Continuing on with their other refutations, they specifically state that the consumer will not be shamed into being sustainable, but I already discussed why this is tied to a social movement as much. They state that grassroots movements are empowering and will actually influence corporation. I already discussed why this is not realistic. The whole point is that we have to work in the current system, whether we like it or not. By making the grassroots, one, inaccessible to the majority, unacceptable to people who have to use these corporations without a choice, you're basically turning them into a pseudo corporation. You're making them controlled by the elite and the few. So that is my time with Grace. If I will be continuing on with the speech in my second opposition block for 4 minutes with a 30-second grace period. My time will begin on my first word. Okay, Judge, just to clear up my final point, the idea is that the only way we can actually make grassroots functional is if we have the consumer base on the side, which will not be occurring under the government's plan. Now, Judge, let's look at a few of I'm just going to go over my 4 contentions, discussing why these are important and discussing their impacts and why they matter more than the government side. Firstly, it hurts the cause itself. Our end result is utilitarianism, which depends on sustainability actually occurring in the near future. We have to look at something that is 1, the most rapid, and 2, the most effective and has the largest magnitude, i.e. creates the largest amount of change. Grassroots change is wonderful, but it also is consumer-based. It's based off the people that make up the grassroots. The only way you can actually change is by changing the corporation, something that can only be done with 1 of 2 options. 1, controlling the consumer base to pressure the corporation, i.e. growing the grassroots operation. This is why it's so key to keep up numbers. Or 2, making sustainability profitable. So how do we accomplish these 2 things under the opposition plan? Firstly, we are able to maintain a larger consumer base by making it more accessible, by not shaming people for using, for example, a Ziploc bag, or for buying something from Starbucks, for example, and using one of their sippy cups instead of a reusable cup. By not shaming these people, you are actually you're making the movement more accessible, which means the more people you have in the movement, firstly, the less elitist it is, and the less it can be lobbied or influenced. And secondly, the more power it has to influence these corporations in turn. But to do that, the only way you can really interact with corporations is through encouragement. We've already seen that happen through positive remarks on Ford and Starbucks, as I gave as 2 specific examples. Now, secondly, the way in the current capitalist system is because, remember, these crises are imminent. There's massive deforestation occurring as at the current moment, is to make sustainability profitable, which means we have to 1, do 2 things. Make the production chain profitable and sustainable, i.e. we should be focusing on the producers, not the companies that actively interact with the consumers, which are the top 100 companies that my partner had defined as, which are Starbucks, Chipotle, et cetera. Because unless we make these producers ethical, we've already ruled out we can't get rid of these distributors. We can't change that. You can't make it actually sustainable. And now the real difference here is how will this play out in the government world? No company will change no company will ever change if people just refuse, if a small grassroots movement breaks itself up and just refuses to go for it. There has never been a company, my opponent has not been able to name a company that has been changed through this sort of negative reinforcement. Yes, we have seen a pressure. We have seen people encourage companies to change, but we've never seen them, I'm going to go into my grace, we've never seen them actually, we've never seen people be like, okay, we're going to boycott all of Starbucks, and that's why they're going to remove plastic straws. It wasn't a boycott. It was a lobbying encouragement where they discussed the economics of changing straws, the economics of making the food more sustainable. In the current status quo, we have to make sure this movement is accessible, which the opposition plan wins on because it has the largest magnitude. It's able to access many more people, and it incorporates people of more socioeconomic statuses. 2, it must have a shorter time frame. And while my opponent's plan focuses on grassroots organizations, which would only succeed under a non-capitalist system that's not oriented by corporation oriented, that takes longer to reform the system than if we are to make the actual current system sustainable. So we went on time frame. And thirdly, impact. The only way we can win this, we can solve these problems imminently, is if we actually make the culprits fix themselves instead of making sustainability elitist and only for the few. And for all these reasons, that is why I am proud to oppose. Thank you very much.
Great speech.
Thank you.
I'm going to give the final speech of this debate, and then I guess we'll see. If everybody's ready, I'd like to give a quick off-time roadmap. So I'm going to start my speech by pointing out, by really sort of defining what each side stands for. Then I'm going to point out some of the clash in this debate. And finally, I will just go over everyone's points. And time, I'm going to set my timer, 5 minutes, starting now. So what the opposition has been telling you is that what they stand for is by pushing these corporations to do better, to be more sustainable. And they state that the only way to do this isn't through encouragement. We on the proposition say the only way that we can push corporations and push environmentalism is by denouncing corporations and their terrible actions. So now let's talk a little bit about these examples they gave. So now the other side, the opposition's point about Ford, I think, is one of the best examples of why you should vote for government. Because do you think, Judge, that by people saying, Ford, you're doing so good, that's how we got electric cars and that's how the development of electric cars happened? No, people lobbying against Ford saying, no, you need to be more sustainable. That's what creates actual change. The opposition asked us to bring up an example of real change that was caused by grassroots organizations. I gave the example of how grassroots organizations were the reason why we had more regulations put on factory farms in the United States. I literally gave that example because the truth is that by encouraging corporations, by holding their hands instead of denouncing them, what's really happening is we're excusing their terrible actions and we're not pushing for more change. And that's what's most important. Furthermore, they talked about how we're isolating people and how they're the side that holds the hand and helps out the little guy. But that's not true because all of their activism is contained in the hands of corporations. What they're essentially saying is that you should buy a Ford. You should go to these companies because they're environmental. What they're saying, they're doing the same exact thing, if not worse, because they're shaming people for not supporting and encouraging these sort of systems. On the other hand, what they're now saying is that we have to support these corporations. That if you don't think that Starbucks making plastic straws banned is this peak activism, then you're the problem. And they're discouraging people from actively calling out the root of the issue. So already that's hypocritical. Now let's talk a little bit about what they said about how we're over-reliant on corporations and how we cannot exist in a society with these corporations. And I agree, we are reliant on corporations, which is exactly why their entire plan and point doesn't make any sense. Because no matter what, we will always need to go to these corporations. No matter what, we'll always have to buy our Chipotle. We'll always have to buy our Starbucks. And that's why we cannot encourage these sort of companies to now become sustainable, because we'll continue to use them. We can't encourage them to become sustainable because, as they state themselves, that's impossible because we'll still be reliant on them. Whereas if we have these grassroots organizations, if we denounce these corporations, what's happening now is that we can now recognize that these corporations are the issue and we can push for change via the government. We can all be for now factory farms without being indebted to these corporations and without saying that these corporations are good. Furthermore, for the net benefit, let's go back to our framework about utilitarianism. Even if they are even if what they're saying is correct, even if somehow these companies are now becoming more sustainable because we're holding their hands through this whole process, even though I've already explained why the only reason these companies are becoming more sustainable is because we're denouncing these companies and we're fighting against them. Let's say they're correct. At the end of the day, even if that's true, if you vote for their side, you're centering corporations and making them seem like they're the good guys, like they're on our side when they're not, when they're indebted to their shareholders, regardless of what the opposition says, you have to recognize that environmentalism and being sustainable will always be more expensive than by just having your large CO2 emissions, by leaking your oil everywhere, by using plastic. And that's exactly why their only example of real sustainable change in the food industry was plastic straws, getting rid of those. What we can use the sippy cup example they gave instead, which are made in factories and are made of literal like plastic or paper that leak out huge amounts of carbon emissions. They're not solving the root of the issue, which is so important for this debate. They're not if we continue to prioritize these corporations, we're essentially saying that it's okay what we're doing, and because of that, we're not going to have any actual change. Because if we're satisfied with the lack of plastic straws, we don't have to call out the fact that Starbucks uses factory farms. If we're satisfied with these sort of sippy cups, we don't have to call out their large CO2 emissions. If what they're saying is true, because in the status quo, I'd like to point out that food ethics organizations are okay with these larger corporations. In the status quo, we already have these 100 companies leaking out these huge, over 70% of carbon emissions. So it's already not working. They haven't been able to give us concrete examples of how they've made any change. In fact, they've completely derailed the food ethics movement because we no longer see lobbying for factory farms. Because if we do that, then we're now villainizing these corporations that we are so pro, and because it'd be hypocritical of this movement to say we love Starbucks, hashtag no more plastic straws, and then for them to say no, we don't want these factory farms. We can't work with the oppressors of this movement. Thank you, Judge. And this is why I encourage you to vote for the government side, because we are pro-grassroots organizations and because we recognize how these corporations are evil and holding us back. Thank you.
Thank you so much, guys, for a truly wonderful debate. The judges are going to deliberate, and if the other two judges are comfortable, they can PM me their decision, and then we can give RFD from there.
Okay, sure.
Hey, Ksenia, you did really well.
Wait. So the judges have decided. I think we can each go around giving RFD, and then we'll just give our decision after each person's RFD. Okay, so I don't know, maybe Christopher wants to go first, or Judge Rafat wants to go first.
I can go first. I'll give my decision and then the reasons I voted, just because it makes more sense in that order for me. I personally voted for Trinity. No, I voted on the government side. First of all, congratulations. You guys technically closed out the novice division of the tournament, so that's fantastic. Great job. But yeah, I voted for the government. I personally voted on the arguments surrounding how profit and sustainability are not compatible, that even if the opposition does have short-term impacts, such as getting rid of plastic straws or the electric car thing with Ford, which I mean isn't completely relevant in a food ethics debate, but still I understand the example, that even if there are small short-term impacts, once it gets to a point where you really need to make change, such as potentially shutting down factory farms or creating whatever solution that is no longer profitable, I think the government side gives good analysis about how that's not going to be possible if you're working with corporations. So I think all the argumentation that comes out of the opposition is really good. And as someone who does not like corporations, I was very intrigued by a lot of your arguments. So I thought you did a very good job. But I think just that little bit of analysis from the government that said that those two things will never be sustainable and will never work in tandem with each other in the long term was what I voted for. And also, although it wasn't really brought up again, I thought the permutation, like doing both of the plans that was brought up in the second government speech, was really good. It wasn't really extended into the last speech. You talked a lot about like how lobbying and stuff is possible while denouncing companies and stuff like that. But I think if you had extended the arguments talking about how you can do both of these things at the same time, would make it even harder for the opposition. And I think in terms of the opposition, responding to that argument would have probably helped you a lot, because if you gave reasons for why specifically hurting the producers that directly give stuff to corporations is better than blaming the corporations, I think if you gave more specific reasons about that, I would have been more inclined to vote for the opposition. But the reasoning that came out of the perm, which was like, there's no reason why grassroots organizations can't also lobby against factory farms because they've done it in the past, was a really strong argument. So that's the gist of why I voted.
Okay, does Judge Rafat want to
go? Sure thing. I vote in favor of the government side in this case. One reason I vote for the government side in this case is because first, I noticed that the opposition side failed to combat one of the government side's main points. that corporations are mainly face pressure from their shareholders, from consumers, and it's hard to juggle sustainability and their shareholders' demands, as I mentioned previously. It's really hard for them to coexist. Furthermore, any examples that the opposition provided, such as a Starbucks example, even the corporation's attempts to be sustainable are minute and end up doing little to no change. And in the case of Starbucks, the disposable straws still produce emissions. So it kind of like cancels out any progress that you made. Hence why I vote in favor of the government side.
Okay, now I can go. So I'm going to talk a bit about how I saw the clash. I kind of saw it between, are we trying to be as pure as possible as the government framed it, or are we trying to be tactical, which is what the opposition is really saying? Are we trying to have the best, are we trying to maintain our movement for as long as possible, and be tactical about how to become the best player or like the winning player when it comes to maintaining like industry relationships. So that's what I saw the clash as, and I took a very long time deliberating. I think it really came down to first of all, what is the main goal of the food ethics movement? Are we trying to be, earning a lot of money? Are we trying to making a name for ourselves, or are we trying to be as ethical as possible? And I think based on the way the debate was set up in terms of framework and in terms of how both of you debated your contentions, it seemed like the general direction was that we are as food ethics movement, the main goal isn't trying to be making a name or making a brand or earning money, but it's really trying to promote what we really want to promote, which is food ethics. And so when it came down to that, then I did vote for the government, because I felt like the government was able to prove in terms of on their side of the clash that we should be pure, we should be absolutely not to the wrong players, so that we can try to get our point across, and in the process the food ethic movements themselves might have a lot of harm. I bought all of the opposition's points when it comes to this is really the best for the food ethics movement, which it probably isn't. But I think that when it comes to the spirit of what these movements want, I feel like the government was able to symbolize that the most. So in terms of feedback for the opposition, I really think it's like you had all the right analysis. If you could tweak the weighing mechanism more in your favor, or you could debate, look, I think it's completely rational to say, sometimes being a political movement isn't about just being, absolutely pushing the agenda. There's a lot of behind the scenes things you have to do. And sometimes that means holding the hands of the enemy. I think that's completely realistic. So if you could just say that one line and tweak all of the points in this direction, the debate would have gone to you. But it was so close, and yeah, I thought it was a very beautiful debate.
I wanted to say one more thing too, just piggybacking off of that. That was a great RFD, both of you. But I really appreciated on the argument from the opposition about accessibility of a movement, because personally, I'm wearing a protect disabled people shirt right now, but when you mentioned, for example, plastic straws are needed for specific disabled people, so we can't get rid of those completely. And you talked about certain clothing brands that are only that are very cheap, so they're accessible to poor people. I think just what hurt you is that this is just about food. You know what I mean? So like a lot of people who are in poverty, the situation is different from buying clothes than buying food. So I think that just the topic in and of itself made it more difficult to make that argument. But I think if you ever get a topic like this again, I thought that was a really interesting and good thing to bring to the debate. And I appreciated hearing about it, because that's a thing that's often overlooked in leftist movements like this. So great job.
Do you guys have any questions or feedback or comments? No? Okay. Well, you can always feel free to DM any of us on Discord. And yeah.
Congratulations.
you so
You
much.
made it to
You guys did
finals, first and
extremely
second
well.
place. Great job.
Congratulations.
See you tomorrow.
Congratulations,
See you
guys.
tomorrow. Yeah. Thank you so much to all the judges' impacts. To all the judge analysis. And congratulations to Elizabeth. So deserved. Such good speeches. Overall, this is a really fun round, even though I will agree with Christopher. Definitely arguing for corporations is a bit hard, rubs you a bit wrong. But yeah, overall, thank you so much for all the commentary, and yeah, have a good day.
Okay, bye. Thank you so much.